You are about to watch the incredible true story of the American Revolution, the war that gave birth to the United States of America and altered the geopolitical landscape of the 18th century world. The year was 1763. The British Empire had just emerged from a global conflict as the dominant power in North America, with its flags flying from the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi River. At this moment, the 13 colonies were among the most loyal in the empire. The people living there saw themselves as proud British subjects, sharing in the victory, and expecting their future to remain tied to the king. But victory had come with a price. The war had nearly doubled Britain's national debt and emptied the treasury, creating a financial crisis that the government in London could not ignore. To pay these debts, British officials began looking across the Atlantic, deciding that the American colonies would have to shoulder a significant portion of the empire's recovery. Parliament viewed the colonies as the most logical source of revenue, assuming that a series of small administrative fees would be the simplest, most efficient way to refill the empty imperial coffers. This strategy became the Stamp Act. These red markings were required on paper goods, as proof a tax was paid to the crown. It reached into every colonial legal transaction, requiring stamps for land deeds, tavern licenses, and university diplomas. It also targeted the press. This 1765 edition of the New Hampshire Gazette was subject to the tax, placing the royal crest at the top of every newspaper and increasing the cost of sharing information. While London saw this as a routine financial measure, they had misunderstood the colonial perspective. What began as a tax on paper was quickly perceived as an overreach of imperial power. Resistance formed almost instantly. From Boston to Philadelphia, merchants and lawyers began to organize, turning the tax into a focal point for colonial frustration. The grievance wasn't just about the cost of the stamps, but who had the right to issue them. The colonists were being taxed by a parliament thousands of miles away, where they held no seats and had no vote. For many, the precedent was the problem. As Parliament could tax their paper without consent today, there was no limit to what they might tax tomorrow. In taverns and meeting halls, a single question began to dominate public life. How can a government tax people who have no voice in that government? This logic spread through the colonies until it was shortened into a powerful, unifying demand: no taxation without representation. By attempting to resolve a debt, the British Empire had inadvertently turned a financial dispute into a debate over sovereignty. The argument was no longer about the cost of a stamp, but whether a distant parliament had any authority to govern a people who were not represented in its halls. The pushback escalated from legal arguments to direct action. Merchants boycotted British imports, while printers published anonymous tracts calling for resistance against the new laws. Years of mounting pressure finally exploded into unrest in the streets of Boston, as crowds began to target tax collectors, and protesters burned symbols of royal authority in open defiance of the law. In an attempt to re-establish control, Britain sent thousands of armed soldiers across the Atlantic to occupy the city and enforce the king's peace. The presence of the military backfired. Instead of restoring order, the soldiers became a constant reminder of the government's willingness to rule through intimidation. As the friction between soldiers and citizens increased, neutral voices began to disappear. The occupation was forcing every colonist to choose a side. Political division now defined the colonies. Neighbors grew suspicious of one another, and the once solid loyalty to the crown began to crumble. In this environment, a clandestine group known as the Sons of Liberty emerged, moving the resistance from public protest to organized underground operations. They operated on the premise that petitions and letters to the king had failed, and that more direct measures were required to protect their interests. Meeting in secret, they planned to demonstrate that if Britain would not listen to the colonies' arguments, they would be forced to deal with their actions. The British government believed that stricter enforcement would eventually break the colonial will. They did not yet realize they were facing a population that was beginning to value self-governance over imperial peace. The spark had been lit, and the momentum toward conflict was becoming irreversible. Soon, a single night in Boston Harbor would provide a provocation so significant that the relationship between the empire and its colonies would be severed forever. To be continued in Episode 2. Next episode, The Night the Tea Fell into the Sea. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to History Stories Dose so you never miss the next chapter of history.